Hey there. Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. Today, I am chatting with Eileen March. Eileen is a former registered midwife turned intuitive coach, and we are diving into the important topic of the courage to rest. We'll get into this podcast right after the quick message.
Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. We are doctors Sarah and Alicia, maternity physicians and moms who have been through it all. We want to empower you with knowledge so you can have the best pregnancy, birth, and postpartum experience you can.
She Found Health and She Found Motherhood is meant for general medical information only. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This information does not apply to every situation. If you have questions or if you've received different advice, please contact your healthcare provider. Always seek the advice of your physician or another qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The views expressed by She Found Health and She Found Motherhood and our guests are not representative of any of the institutions with which we are affiliated. Some of our podcast episodes are sponsored so that we can keep getting great info out there to you, our listeners. We only partner with companies that we truly believe in. Some of our links and suggestions may be affiliates, and we would appreciate you using them to help fund this important work. Now let's get to it.
Good morning, Eileen.
Good morning, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy that we're finally connecting.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Right? So I wanted to start just by asking you to introduce yourself a little bit about who you are and how you got into this work around rest and the courage to rest.
Yeah, sure. I'm Eileen. Hi.
Hi, Eileen.
Um, I feel like I change my titles all the time, just as I try to find like that little sweet spot. But I call myself an intuitive coach, a wild medicine energy healer, and a slow living witch.
Love
And
it.
for those people who are like, witch, what does she mean by that? Really, for me, that word is a reclamation of the connection to my feminine wisdom, to the earth, to my body, to the seasons and the cycles, and also creating a culture of care for community. So it's really can get more magical, but it doesn't actually mean something that's totally woo
Mhm.
to me, though it can. And I came into this line of work having been a midwife for 6 years and a student for 4 years before that. So I often
Yeah,
say,
it's a long time. 10 years.
yeah, a decade in that field, immersed in medicine and midwifery. And I loved being a midwife. I loved especially the role of a midwife in empowering their clients to trust their bodies, to
Yes.
trust their ability to birth, to feel safe asking questions and advocating for themselves. Those are some things that I think midwifery as a profession does quite well. Informed decision making, not just informed
Yeah.
consent. And I loved being with women as they made that transition into motherhood or into becoming a mother again and just helping walk them through those early days. It was really a place of great privilege and a place of great burnout.
Yeah.
And especially the way that the midwifery model is in Canada, the primary continuity of care piece requires that midwives be on call a lot of the time, which is great for client-centered care and not so great for midwifery longevity. I'm pretty sure that the kind of average burnout rate for midwives in Canada is still about 5 years, which is
So crazy.
crazy. So I made it 6. So I feel like I'm
Right?
winning.
Yeah.
But I got to this place and, COVID hurried along the end of my career for sure, but I got to this place where I was just feeling, trapped and
Mhm.
starting to become resentful of when my phone would ring, and the last thing I ever wanted to do was bring resentment into a birth room, and I was
Yeah.
really good at leaving it at the door when I actually got to a birth, but to have that sinking feeling anytime my phone rang, it just didn't jive with me, and so I started to look for ways to continue to help people, but without the constraints of being on call and tied to the city and tied to my phone. And I stumbled upon coaching. I actually didn't know what a life coach was. I
Mhm.
had no idea. But one of my girlfriends was taking a course and writing these really beautiful blog posts about the personal development she was experiencing. And I was like, this sounds good. It's COVID. I live alone. I am going out of my mind. I need something. And so I applied for and was accepted into the Center for Applied Neuroscience 9-month life coaching program out of Toronto. And almost simultaneously, I also stumbled on another retired midwife who burned out spectacularly
Mhm.
and started to offer teachings and trainings combining what she knew about women's holistic health with the more woo spiritual side of things in energy
Mhm.
medicine. And so that's where the energy healer, the wild medicine energy healing training happened for me. And that was a year-long immersement in a little bit more magic and enchantment in life.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And I love I think that there's so much like synergy between midwifery and like what you talk about, like finding that magic in life, right? Because midwifery is, I am not a midwife. I'm a family physician who supports pregnant and birthing people. But I have many friends and colleagues who are midwives, and there is a different way of being when you're a midwife,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I often think fondly or think about the apocalypse, which is
Eileen, you're so
a bit
funny.
odd. But if the situation occurred that the world fell apart and I got to just be a midwife in homes, keeping that sanctity and safety of birth in people's homes, I don't think I would have burnt out the same way that
Yeah,
I did,
yeah.
being part of this really legalized, medicalized model. There's so many times as a midwife where my intuition and instincts were like, this is fine. Everything is
Mhm.
fine. And I had to recommend a course of action to my clients that I didn't actually agree with in my own
Yeah,
self, but I couldn't impart to them
yeah.
all of my knowledge and understanding and intuition in the moment. And so there's a lot more intervention and fear around birth than there really needs to be.
Yeah, and there's that could be a whole other podcast, but it's the system, right? Like it's not midwifery as a profession, but it's the system that you're
Mhm.
working
That you're
in.
part of,
Yeah.
yeah, that whole system, and it's gotten much better even over the course of my 10 years in Calgary. I really noticed a shift in the attitudes of nurses and obstetricians towards midwives. It became more collaborative, at least in some of our centers, but there's still a lot of friction there, and a lot of the midwives just bring their messes into us and, like, the emergencies, and it's
Mm.
yeah, there is definitely often a bit of feelings of not being really safe actually with your
Mhm.
colleagues in the hospital. And so that definitely contributes to it as well. And then on top of that, it's a medical world and it's the same, I'm sure, with physicians, but there's like this midwives eat their young sense coming through training, right? And I know that physicians, it's the same. Like,
Mhm.
you got to make them hard. You got to make them be able to deal with 36 hours no sleep and keep
Yeah,
continuing to
I
train
went through
children.
this, I suffered, and you have to too.
Yeah, exactly. And then even once you're a midwife, this one-upmanship over how tired you are and how much
Oh,
you've done. And
yeah.
like, I remember doing 4 births in a 16-hour span once overnight. 3 of them were home births. They were all multips, obviously. Not
Gosh.
people who'd had babies before. I didn't even know
And
how I pulled
Calgary's a
it
big
off.
city.
Calgary's a big city, and the last one 3 of them were home births, and the last one was in the hospital, and I remember sitting with the midwife who'd backed me up for the first one
Mhm.
and the third one, and talking about this is a crazy night, and she had to pull out a story about when she did 5 births in 6 and, like,
Yeah.
just, this constant push, and it's throughout our culture of losing more sleep than or working harder than or doing more than the other person is, like, a badge of honor, and it's
Yeah.
such a broken way to operate in the world.
Oh, it's so true, and it's such a good segue into what we were gonna talk about today, and rest and finding the courage to rest, and it's so funny because literally it's so ingrained in us because as you're telling that story, I wanna be like, "Oh my gosh, one night I was on call and I had 7 right? Like, we just
Yeah.
have this it's so ingrained in us, this one-upmanship, and I remember in my OB-GYN days, so before I switched into family medicine, I have this distinct memory of being in the call room at BC Women's Hospital with one of the residents a year below me, and the 2 of us bragging to each other about how little sleep we got. Yeah, and it's so backwards, right?
So backwards. So back you want your care providers rested,
Yeah.
and you want a system that supports their rest.
Yeah.
And when you end up with a system that really doesn't, and I think this ripples out through society, the lack of community care for each other and support for each other throughout our society, it adds to this level of burnout that we're all experiencing to some degree or another, that was definitely exacerbated by COVID and the emotional outcomes or ramifications that are still starting to be felt and ripple out from that experience that we all went through to some degree or another. And it's time for it to stop. It's time for us to
Yeah.
rest and to
Yeah.
celebrate rest, and rest not as a means to be more productive.
Yes. And one of the things I would love for you to speak a bit more about is like this idea that we have to earn rest. Oh, I'm allowed to rest now because I just did 24, 36 hours on call or something. And that rest is like something that we all need, and that we don't have to earn it. It's something that,
Yeah, that what you're speaking about is such an ingrained part of like capitalism,
mhm,
the patriarchy, white
mhm,
supremacy,
mhm.
this trio, this
Yes.
trifecta. But our society, it doesn't function or operate if people aren't equating their worth to how much they can produce and do. And when you're equating your worthiness to your productivity, then you do need to earn your rest if you're running that story, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
rest feels lazy. I have a book behind me somewhere
Yes.
called Laziness Does Not Exist. It's a good one, written by a person with their PhD in, can't remember exactly, sociology, I think.
Okay.
Anyways, they talk about how laziness has been invented by the church because sin
Yeah.
and sloth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then capitalism has really compounded upon this. And I really believe that a lot of that is because exhausted people can't fight the system. You can't fight back. And so it's like this remembering. This is a lot of the work that I do. There are other great books about rest behind me too. Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance is a fantastic one, that we really need to reclaim our innate inherent right to rest as human beings, and not as a reward for
Yeah.
getting it all done, and not as a means to be able to do more, purely because you are human, you are on this earth, you are in a body, you deserve to rest.
I know. It's so hard. I myself will admit I'm really bad at this.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm
Me
getting
too.
I'm getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely like I teach what I need. That's my
Right?
goal in
Yes.
life, is to
Yes.
teach what I need.
Yes. I feel like I probably do the same now that you say that. So how can we, like, as mothers, as parents, as care providers, how can we start to rewrite that story and that narrative within us, starting with the idea that we're lazy if we're resting, and that if we rest without having earned it, we're lazy. It's like
Mhm.
this, like,
This loop.
cycle, right? Yes, loop. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. I think the first step is definitely bringing awareness to the story and the belief, because without awareness that it's running or operating in our bodies, it's really hard to change anything. And it's really tied into, I want to make sure we don't forget to talk about good girl syndrome. So I'm
Oh
going to
my
use
gosh.
that as a
Thank you.
segue into
Yes.
how.
Yes.
um, so while everybody's affected by this whole hustle culture mentality and that rest is lazy, women are more impacted by this because of the added pressure of what it means to be a good woman or a good girl. So I often talk about good girl syndrome. When I first came up with this term, I was like, I've coined a new term. I had not. It is Googleable. But it's really this characterization of good women as being the people pleasers, right? The
Mhm.
people who take care of everybody else's needs ahead of their own, the mother martyr syndrome that we
Mhm.
have, right? And again, coming back to one-upmanship of, oh, I'm so self-sacrificing for my family, for my friends, for everybody around me. I come last. And that really feeds into this. Everybody else gets to rest, but I don't until everything is done.
Mhm.
To the extent that I struggle when I've cooked dinner and my partner gets up to clean afterwards, I really struggle to just let him clean,
Yeah. Yeah.
even though I've done all the cooking. And I really struggle to ask to have a glass of water brought to me, for instance. If I'm on the couch and he's up getting one for himself, I'm getting a lot better with practice. But it's really hard when we've lived our whole lives being told that a good girl is quiet, put everybody's needs ahead of their own, ignores their intuition because that might make them a little bit too feisty or loud or going off in a direction that doesn't suit everybody else. And that conforming to fit in piece as well.
Yeah, it's so true. And I just see it like in myself as like a wife and mother to 3 boys, and how I've been like intentionally like sitting and reading while the house is messy and modeling that, because I think that's so important too.
It's super important, especially if you have girls, because
Mhm.
they're not going to have anyone else modeling it. Likely, I often talk to women and have experienced it myself where, yeah, their partners work really hard, but then they come home at the end of the day and they're just fine putting their feet up on the couch watching a show. There's no like that associated guilt of, like, oh, it stacks the laundry. It doesn't even register often. And again, it's just that socialization piece.
Yeah.
And so I love what you said there about intentionally like sitting down and reading a book, even if the house is messy, because that's how it starts. That's how we start practicing, is resting despite the discomfort.
Oh my gosh, yes, the discomfort. And I love that you said that. I was just having this thought in my head about how I project onto my husband. I'm sitting there reading, and if he's doing something, I'm like, "Oh my God, he thinks I'm being so lazy, but he's just not saying it," right? This internal
Yeah.
dialogue that we have. And
Yeah.
he's actually a wonderful partner and a great parent, and probably not thinking that at all. But then I like internalize it. So then I'm like, okay, put my book down, and I get up and start cleaning too or something.
Right, exactly. That's a very common experience, and this comes back to, like, worthiness, to feeling worthy inside of our relationships, to ask for equity in our
Mhm.
partnerships. And this is where a lot of my coaching with my one-on-one clients falls into this. Yes, we're talking about rest and finding more of it and creating space for it. But a lot of that work really comes back to having the courage and reconnecting to that inner power of remembering that, yeah, I deserve to rest just as much as he does. I deserve to have my needs met and express my needs just as much as he or she does, as
Yep.
they do.
Yep.
Often, so much of women's work, the work that women not fall into because of our conditioning, is not measurable, right?
Yes.
Staying home
Yes.
with the kids all day is with the house is a mess, but you manage to keep them fed and alive. Like the amount of effort that goes into that, it's
Oh,
not acknowledged by our
no.
society and it's not valued. And so for a stay-at-home mom, for instance, to
Mhm.
have their partner come home from their 9 to 5 and say, "I need help. Can you take them?" And the partner to be like, "I worked all day." And we internalize that as, "Oh, yeah, he did work all day," or to the extent that a lot of us won't even ask for that help or support
Yep.
because we feel badly because we want them to be rested and well and happy, but we don't value ourselves highly enough to want that for ourselves also.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy. I just will keep using that word, even though I probably shouldn't. But I I'm aging myself now, but whatever. I'm very loud and proud about my mid-40s. So I did my undergrad 96 to 2000, and I did my undergrad in economics. This is going somewhere. And my thesis was on like women returning to the labor force after, anyways, which is crazy that I did that in my like late teens. But there's this book, and it's by Marilyn Waring, and she's an economist from New Zealand, and it's called What Men Value and What Women Are Worth. And it's all about unpaid labor. And so we're going back. I can't do that math, Eileen. I haven't had enough coffee. Is that like 20, 30 years? 90s to the right? That's
28 years ago, yeah?
yeah. And we're now actually just starting to talk about this as a culture, right?
Yeah. It's
It's
wild.
crazy. It's crazy.
That's my replacement word for crazy, is wild.
Wild. Okay, thank you. Because I don't,
You're welcome.
as a physician, I'm like, should I be using the word crazy?
Yeah,
Just
it's one
thinking
of those
about
ones that we
language?
probably shouldn't when we're thinking about
Yeah.
language. And I was like, but I need something that's quick and
Yes.
easy. And yeah,
Okay,
so
thank you.
wild.
Wild. That is wild. It's wild. Right? And I'm sure her book was published even before I did my project
Right.
and I
yeah.
discovered her. Yeah. So for all the busy listeners, women, female identifying parents, care providers, how can we move towards having the courage to rest, coming from this culture where it's been indoctrinated into us as parents, as women, as care providers who always put the needs of others first? What can we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different kind of ways that you can start to intentionally incorporate more rest into your days. One of the biggest things is like actually scheduling it in, especially if you are busy. And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be like long moments of rest. It can be 5 minutes of
Mhm.
mindful breathing, reading a book. You mentioned it can be a cat nap or a power nap in the afternoon. Often when we think about rest, we're like, rest is sleep, rest is
Yeah.
lying down. And
Yeah.
it can be. It certainly is a part of rest and a very necessary part. But rest is anything where your mind is allowed to be still or to wander. And so even things like folding laundry can be restful, but don't have a podcast on at the same time or be
Guilty. Yes.
consuming. That's fine to do too. That can be fun. And
But
reading a
sometimes
book
you're
or
always
listening to
trying to
something is
consume. Yeah.
exactly, right? We're
Yeah.
always trying to consume, we're trying to fill all these places spaces, so that's one way. Practicing noticing the micro moments of rest, so especially on those days where you're like, "There's literally not a second for me to breathe," it feels. Getting into your car, notice the way that the light refracts off the windshield, and maybe it's pretty. Or doing the dishes and noticing the way that the soap smells, and that might
Mhm.
be an enjoyable sensation. Coming back into the body
Mhm.
frequently with practice is a great way to incorporate more rest, knowing it's going to be uncomfortable and doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And often the thing that helps there is to engage your family or your partner and say, I am consciously trying to take more rest for myself. And here's the story I tell myself when I sit down on the couch and the house is
That's
dirty.
yes, I need to do that.
Can you help me by saying, like, reminding me that you actually aren't judging me or maybe
Yeah.
even encouraging me to do it? My current partner is really good at being like, you need to take a break, go lay down, which is to me, I'm like, but the things aren't done.
Yeah.
And then the last kind of big piece for me that has been really impactful and powerful, especially at helping me shed those feelings of guilt for resting, is tuning into my body energetic cycles, but also the larger patterns of nature. I talk a
Oh,
lot about
yes.
that cyclical living piece, right? Knowing as women, if you're in a body that is still menstruating, that you have these ebbs and flows of energy through the month and knowing what each of those phases of your cycle mean for you energetically, but then also the mirror of that in the moon if you're not menstruating. And then on a larger scale in the seasons, we live in this society where we're in or we're forced to be in perpetual spring, summer, plant
Yeah.
harvest. And the earth doesn't operate like that. And you are of the earth. We are literally nature. That
Mhm.
gets forgotten a lot because of the divide that's happened in Western philosophy over the last several hundred years of humans are apart from nature, but we are actually a part of
Yeah, we're
nature.
mammals.
We're mammals. And so just like in nature, like you need autumn to let the leaves fall, the things that aren't serving anymore. You need them to fall to the ground so that they can decompose over the long rest of winter, turning into fertile soil for those new seeds in spring to be able to grow. And so we have our caffeine and our other stimulants and things that we use that are like chemical fertilizers to keep us in this constant spring summer. And it's just like that style of agriculture strips the land and actually turns it into a desert. So too does this way of life turn us into barren landscapes within ourselves.
Wow, I love that analogy, whether it's like to the monthly cycle or to the seasons. And I think it's so true, like that plant harvest. I'm unrelated, but I just, the thought came up. So I'm going to share. I'm reading this book right now. I found my new favorite fiction author, Kristen Hanna. Have you read any of
Mm,
her stuff?
no, but I'll
Oh
add
my
it to my
gosh.
list.
Yeah. So she writes primarily historical fiction for any
Oh,
listeners.
love.
Oh my gosh, your summer has just changed. So a girlfriend of mine lent me The Woman, which is her most recent publication, and it's about a nurse, an American nurse during the Vietnam War, going to Vietnam and her experience as being a woman and during all that political unrest. Anyway, so then I've read The Nightingale, which is also amazing, and now I'm reading, I think it's called The Four Winds, and it's about the Depression, and the family started off in Texas and about how they because they didn't tend to the land, right? And like
Mhm.
none of the wheat would grow and it turned into and it's so that came to mind. It's like that we actually just have to nurture our bodies, right? And we have to
Mhm.
allow them to rest and recover so that we can continue to like harvest, so to speak, right? So we
Yeah.
can and do what we need to do or what we want to do
Yeah.
to grow
It's
and
like the
survive.
ultimate permission. For
Hmm.
me, that is the thing when I'm getting into that hustle mode and that you have to do more, you're not being productive enough, you're being lazy, coming back to the knowledge of the seasons and the earth and my place on it, it's like this immediate switch for my guilt. It turns it right off. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, I'm a human. I'm a
Yeah.
human body. I'm a
Yeah.
human being. I'm a human being, not a human doing,
Oh,
as the
that's like one
saying
of my
goes.
favorite. That's so favorite. Like when
Yeah.
people, you're like, oh, right. I am a
Yeah.
human being. I need to
No
just
matter
be
how many times I
sometimes.
hear it, I'm like, oh yeah, I needed to hear that again.
Yeah. Yeah. Again and again. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's so true. And it's such important messaging. And I think primarily folks listening are women or female identifying. And there's so much that we can do to model this, right? Whether you're a mom modeling it for your children, both male and female children, whether you're a care provider, modeling it for the learners coming behind you, right? And talking about that culture
Mhm.
that you and I still do practice some medicine and the midwifery culture that you came from. And imagine if you had a senior mentor who encouraged and valued rest and said, no, you
Yeah.
go and sleep, right? No, how different your experience might have been.
So different. I think about actually even my students coming through because I precepted for several years or 3 years, I think. As soon as I was able to precept, I started precepting with my practice partner. And we consistently had students saying how much they enjoyed having us as preceptors because we treated them like adult learners that they were
Hmm.
and cared
Yeah.
about their
Yeah.
ability to maintain a balance and remembered really closely what it was like to come through that program as well. I think that was a helpful piece because we weren't too distanced from it, but it was such a simple thing just to be kind.
Yeah. And it goes so far, right? In
Yeah.
their experience and their reflections. And I'm sure those midwives today would remember that experience with you. I
Mhm.
distinctly remember some of my staff who allowed me to rest.
Right.
And that was like 15 years ago. And you still
Yeah.
remember those like distinct episodes, right? Which tells you how little we are.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, nurses coming in to relieve me just for an hour, say, in the hospital and me feeling like I couldn't take that full hour, like I could
Hmm.
never unplug. So I was like, "That's my job she's doing." And that push, that drive to not appear lazy or be lazy or put any undue pressure on other people it's so deep-seated.
Yeah,
And
it is. And
hard.
it makes me think of like, again, this could be a whole other podcast, but like our ability to receive.
Yes. Oh, huge. That's a big part of this, like, the good girl syndrome too, that we don't receive, we give.
Yep.
That's what good girls do. They give
Yep.
of themselves constantly. So asking is like the next step to receiving. You
Yeah.
know, first you have to be open to receive support, love, nurturing, kindness, all of those things, and have it really land in your body. And then the next kind of step is like, oh my goodness, to ask for that love, support, and then be able to hold it when it comes it's a skill you had to develop.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that's part of the power of you offer a group coaching program. I do a
Hmm.
lot of one-on-one, but a part of the power of walking with somebody who can hold that awareness for you and bring you back to it and help with the underlying stories that are running. That's why it's so powerful.
Oh, yeah. It's crazy the stories that we tell ourselves, right? And the narratives and how just like learning to sit in the discomfort, right?
Yeah.
And allowing it instead of saying, no, I'm fine. It's good. I'm good. I'm good. I'm fine. Like not taking a
Right.
compliment, not taking any,
Yeah. Yeah.
all of
That's a great
that.
place to practice
Yes.
receiving is with
Yes.
compliments
Yeah.
because it is so low stakes to be
Yep.
able to just say, thank you so much instead
Mhm.
of brushing it off or saying how cheap the skirt was or
Yes.
we always have
Yes.
a
Oh my
we always
gosh.
have a thing to caveat it. Oh, thank you, but I really don't deserve it because
Yeah.
it happens often because we are uncomfortable. Again, that's like the sin of pride.
Mhm.
And heaven forbid we might be prideful.
Yeah. So interesting. Hey, like this conversation could just continue and continue. But I'm wondering if you would tell me a little bit, and if you don't want to, that's fine. We'll edit it out. But about the book you're writing.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. Yes.
In fits and starts, it's going
Mhm.
much slower than I would have hoped. However, I'm probably about halfway through from a like manuscript length situation, and it's called The Courage to Rest.
Mm.
And it's interesting because I love writing. I've always loved writing. And so when I first set out to write it, it was really with the intent of it being like a quote unquote thought leader book, which is practical examples from real life, from my clients' lives, but like a very practical manual of finding the courage to rest. And it's becoming a little bit more of a poetically rambling memoir with some
Love
wisdom
it.
dropped in it.
Yes.
My book editor was like, "What are you writing?" I'm like, "I don't know. We're gonna find out when I'm done." But it really is, it's weaving in my own journey and the wisdom of the seasons and a lot of work with emotions, actually. When I started to write, the first thing that came up was, oh, when we take time to rest, a lot of women, on top of feeling guilty about it, also are a bit afraid of what might come up, of the
Mm.
emotions that maybe you haven't been attending to, or the life situations that you're like, it's okay if I just don't look at it, it's fine, everything is fine. The dog in the burning room.
Yes.
Um,
My favorite
and when you
meme.
sit down, right?
Yeah.
When you sit down to start resting and being with yourself, those emotions and those realities, they're harder to ignore, which is a good thing, but it can feel scary and it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so as I started to write, it was like my own experiences of coming up against some of these emotions, beginning with grief and addressing it and attending to it and being okay in it. A lot of those more uncomfortable emotions, much like rest, are things that we don't allow ourselves the opportunity to experience. We try to shove
Yeah.
them down or hurry past them. And it does us a disservice. And so the book is a lot about that and navigating that.
Oh my gosh. I can't wait to read it. And I couldn't agree more with that. To draw a parallel for those of us in the medical fields and in the birth workers, we see amazing things and we see, unfortunately, some really sad things. And we're taught to do this, right?
Mhm.
Shove them down. And so learning to deal with emotions, which do come up, right? And that's why
Yeah.
people, they run, they consume substances, they overeat, they schedule themselves. Because a lot of us are trying to run away from things that we're not. We come from a generation of, I have incredible parents, but we didn't talk a lot about emotions, right? It's not
Yeah.
something that generation was taught to do.
Yeah. And to name or to be with. And it's
Mhm.
uncomfortable for those around us. And so, again, that good girl syndrome triggers. It's like, I don't want to make other people uncomfortable. So I'm just not going to show that I'm feeling this.
Mhm.
And often we end up having those emotions come for us in the night when we're alone and feeling really isolated. It really exacerbates this like culture of loneliness that I alluded to. That
Mm.
was, again, COVID made it so much more obvious how disconnected we are from each other and our communities. And we're not meant to be in isolation. We are communal animals.
Oh my God, we're social
Our
beings.
nature. We are social
Yeah.
beings. We are social animals. We're not meant to process alone.
No.
We're not meant to understand ourselves without the reflection of others and that ability for others to see us and mirror to us how we are and who we are in the world. That's an important part of moving through this world, is that connection. And so when we stuff down those big uncomfortable emotions and only experience them alone or not at all, we really cut off a huge part of our connection to other people.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. We could just go off on a whole other tangent. I couldn't agree more with the connection piece. And statistically speaking, because my background in epidemiology, I have to throw it out there, but we
Mhm.
are living in isolation. More people than
Mhm.
ever are living alone. And more people than ever are reporting feelings of loneliness. And I think it's crazy too, is that loneliness is subjective, right? So you could be living with other people, but still feel
And
really
still feel
alone because
alone.
you don't have that connection, right? And that sort of
Yeah.
deeper bond.
The emotional connection. I think we're seeing that awareness of this. As you mentioned, we've got studies showing the loneliness epidemic and the negative health impact that has on us as well. You literally can die of loneliness. And I think for me in this work, it's really been interesting to see this kind of shift of awareness, especially among women, of the deep need to return to community and sisterhood specifically. And that's where that witchcraft comes back in, right? Is that the witches, the women who were persecuted as witches, were the hubs of the community. They were the wise women, the tenders, the midwives, the people who created that sense of connection in community. And there's so much power in coming together and sharing experiences together, whether in person or online. There's like an added layer of magic in person, but online
It's crazy how much.
amazingly effective.
Yeah. I know. It's incredible. Oh my gosh, Eileen, I feel like you and I could talk forever. I have loved this conversation. I'm so excited for your book. And I'm wondering if you could share with listeners how they can learn more about you, where they can find you, and anything that you're offering right now through your coaching programs and one-on-ones.
Yeah, certainly. So as far as where to find me, you can come find me on Instagram at I am Eileen March or on my website, which is myluminouslife.ca. If you head over there, you're going to get a fun little pop-up asking if you'd like to know which witch you are.
Oh, I love that.
So I've got a quiz. It's silly, but it's also leads right into my work in that it tells you which kind of witch you are, but it tells you what kind of rest your body is craving based on the type of witch you are.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a fun little freebie that I have, and it gets you into my world and my email. I really love connecting with people with my words, and so my email list is really my favorite place to hang out. I also have an affirmations for worthiness and abundance. That's a free recording if you're feeling like you want to start to deepen those feelings of worthiness. And I'm sure we'll be including all of this stuff in the show notes.
Yes, it will all be in the show notes.
Yeah, so there's that link there. And then one-on-one offerings, I am like a soft closed door right now, depending when you're listening to this, but I am always open to people inquiring about one-on-one work. I'm reinventing a slightly new container for the fall, but my offering to this point has been a 6-month container of one-on-one work that involves coaching and the energy healing work that I do as well to support you in that slow, gentle transformation. Lots of time for integration. That's what I find is missing from a lot of coaching containers for me personally. And then the Wheel of the Year celebrations or ceremonies. So marking those shifting seasons, that with women's circles is something that I do with all my clients, and my one-on-one clients get to come to those as part of working with me. And then anybody can join those if they're feeling the call for a little more sisterhood and community and ritual.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to put all of that in the show notes. And I want to come to one of your Wheel of the Year ceremonies.
Yeah. The next one's on August 2nd, which is the Friday of the long weekend.
Okay. I think if I'm around, I'll be there.
Yeah.
Thank you again so much. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to connecting again.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out our website at www.shefoundhealth.ca and to sign up for our community for weekly bump blasts. Make sure to check us out on Instagram or Facebook at she.found.motherhood and head on over to your favorite podcast app and leave a review and a 5-star rating. If you enjoyed this podcast, take a pic of yourself listening to it and share it on social. Make sure to tag us on it so we know to keep making them.